Firstly, my dear students, how are you all? I hope you all are keeping fine. I welcome you all to the last clip on our chapter, that is globalization. So let's get started. In this clip, we'll learn about the resistance to globalization and India and globalization. Now, as discussed in the earlier clips, globalization is a very controversial subject, okay, and it has invited strong criticism all over the globe. There has been debates going on in terms of the effects of globalization. Some say that globalization is good and that it has benefited the people in general, but then there are others who say that globalization has negative effects, which we have already learned in our second clip. So here we'll learn about the criticisms against globalization from the leftist and the rightist perspective. Well, first to the leftist views. Now, the leftist means those people who believe in social equality or who believes in the ideology of social equality, all right? And they are against globalization because they believe that the contemporary globalization, it represents a particular phase of global capitalism that makes the rich richer, of course, which is few in number, and the poor poorer. We have already discussed in our second video how globalization benefits only the developed countries and the multinational companies. Now, the multinational companies, they invest in those countries from which they think they'll benefit or get profit. And because of the entry of multinational companies, many small cottage industries had to close down since they couldn't compete against the price and the quality of the products of multinational companies. All right. And the multinational companies, in order to get even more profit, they try to cut down their cost by looking for cheapest suppliers. And this leads to lower wages and longer working hours for the workers. So the workers who are poor, they get even poorer. And the money that the multinational companies save by cutting down the cost, it adds to the profit of the multinational companies, of course, and they become even richer. We've also talked about how the Western countries force the developing and the underdeveloped countries to enter globalization because it benefits the Western countries. The leftists also criticize the globalization by saying that it has reduced the capacity of the state to protect the interests of the poor. The state's role as a welfare state is reduced. The leftists believe that the entry and the increased role of the multinational companies all over the world leads to a reduction in the capacity of governments to take decisions on their own and has limited the functions of the government. Now, many of the government's decisions are influenced by the multinational companies. The state's attention and concern towards the welfare of people has minimized. The states all over the world nowadays only perform certain core functions such as the maintenance of law and order and the security of its citizens, again, which we have already discussed under the political consequences. Next, we'll talk about the rightist views against globalization. Now, rightists are those people, you can say, who are nationalist, who believes in authority and who hold conservative views. So the rightists express their anxiety over the political, economic, and cultural effects. In terms of political, they fear the weakening of the state's capacity, which I've already explained under the leftist views. So I'm not going to repeat here. In terms of economy, in your book, it explains they want a return to self-reliance and protectionism, at least in certain area of economy. Let me explain you what this means. Now, we know that with the entry of the multinational companies, our cottage industries as well as the small-scale industries are affected, and it has led to closure of these industries since they couldn't compete against the multinational companies, which we just talked about earlier. All right. As a result of globalization, we become dependent on foreign goods. And this is what the rightists are against. They want their country's economy to be self-reliant and thus have called for protectionism. Now, protectionism means protecting domestic producers by limiting the import of foreign goods and services. And how do we do that? By raising the taxes on the imports. Okay, and by raising the taxes on imports, the foreign goods become expensive and the local producers can at least compete with them in terms of prices. For example, the fact that we buy Chinese goods is because it's cheaper than Indian products. Now, under protectionism, the government will raise the taxes, which will in turn make the price of Chinese goods higher. And this is done so that the consumers will buy the Indian products, and this will in turn protect the domestic producers. Third one is the cultural. Now, we have already learned in our second clip under the cultural consequences about the effects of globalization on culture, which has led to homogenization, that is, a uniform culture, or westernized culture, and heterogenization, that is, a culture turning into modified culture, which is different and distinct. And with the impact of globalization, now the rightists, they are worried about the losing of the age-old values or the tradition and culture. Okay. And then the anti-globalization movements. Now we know that there are people in different parts of the world who criticize globalization. And these people participate in global networks to launch anti-globalization movements. We must remember that many anti-globalization movements, they are not opposed to the idea of globalization per se, but then they are opposed to a program of globalization, how globalization is taking place. All right, how the developed countries are forcing the underdeveloped countries to enter into globalization, that also for their own benefit, and controlling their market, in which they see a form of recolonization or neocolonization. For example, in 1999, at the World Trade Organization's ministerial meeting, there were widespread protests at Seattle alleging unfair trading practices by the economically powerful states. It was argued that the interests of the developing world were not given sufficient importance in the evolving of the global economic system, and that everything is controlled by the Western or the powerful countries. We have already talked about how the World Trade Organizations and the IMF are influenced by these developed Western countries. And then there is World Social Forum, or the WSF, which is another global platform. Now, this is a forum which is composed of many groups such as human rights activists, environmentalists, labor, youth and women activists, all getting together and oppose to the neoliberal globalization for one or the other reason. We'll then talk about India and globalization. Globalization has taken place through much of human history, and if you remember clearly, in the first clip, I told you how our Tibetan script is an example of this globalization. If you talk about India, India has been known for its trade in spices and cotton throughout history. But here we'll focus on India and globalization on three different phases. The first phase, globalization during colonial period. During the colonial period, India became an exporter of primary goods and raw materials and a consumer of finished goods. I think a good example would be from your English lesson, Indigo. So the people of India had to face huge loss since they sold their raw materials at a cheaper rate and paid higher prices for finished goods. So they felt the need to protect and strengthen the domestic producers. So after independence, in order to protect the domestic producers, India adopted closed economy. So here we are talking about the after independence phase. They decided not to allow others to export to India. Okay, India tried to produce everything by themselves. Although there were some advances or improvements and it did help the small scale industries, however, like the Soviet Union, India's economic growth also suffered and India faced financial crisis in 1990. They faced slow development. Technology-wise, they were backward, and on top of that, they faced shortage of foreign exchange. India, even had to take loan from the World Bank, and the World Bank suggested India to liberalize their economy and to enter the globalization. Okay, so we learned earlier that World Bank and other international economic institutions are controlled by Western countries, if you remember clearly. So in a way, here we are talking about forced economy. We are seeing a forced economy where the World Bank, under the influence of Western countries, is influencing a developing country to liberalize their economy so that they can take advantage. So anyway, in 1991, responding to the financial crisis and the desire for higher rates of economic growth, India changed its policy. From closed economy, it liberalized its economy. It deregulated, or in other words, it lifted restrictions on various sectors, including trade and foreign investments. Okay, India signed free trade agreements with various countries, and some of the reforms were: the public sector companies were open to private, restrictions on exports were reduced by reducing taxes, business and industrialists from outside were invited. So as a result, you see multinational companies here in India: Samsung, Apple, McDonald's, KFC, Nike, you just name it, which was not there in India before 1991. Before 1991, in Indian market, you could see only goods made in India. For example, if you talk about shoes, there was Liberty, Action, etc., all Indian companies. And you could hardly find Adidas or Nike or Reebok. TV was mostly Oneida, scooter was Bajaj, and cars was Ambassadors. And the same was in the case of other products. But then due to liberalization in 1991, these days you see a whole range of foreign goods readily available for us in markets. Finally, we have India's resistance to globalization. Now, we know that globalization is a controversial subject, and thus in India also, there are sections of people who are against globalization. Here we'll again talk from two different perspectives, the left wing and the right wing. Left wing, or the leftists, or as I said earlier, people who believe in equality. As already explained earlier, the leftists feel that globalization leads to inequality and the gap between the rich and the poor wider. Okay, they believe that globalization benefits a few section of people, that is the richer section of the people, and it makes the rich richer, and especially the developed countries richer. Since liberalization has a huge role in globalization, they protest against the economic liberalism. And they do it through political parties like communist parties, as well as forums like Indian Social Forum. We have already talked about the World Social Forum. Now here, since this is related to India, we're talking about Indian Social Forum. Okay. Now, second, is that the leftists, they also believe that because of the entry of the multinational companies, it has led to the closure of many domestic producers and loss of jobs of many people. Okay, we have already again talked about this earlier. Thus, the trade unions as well as farmers' union have organized protest against the entry of the multinational companies. Since they feel that the multinational companies control and have monopoly over their market, they protest against the multinational companies' entry. Social movements, trade union movements, workers' movements, farmers' agitation, these are some forms of resistance to globalization. And finally, the patenting of plants like neem by American and the European firms has also generated a widespread opposition in India. Now, what is patenting? Patenting is a law that deals with intellectual property, or let's say your ideas, new inventions. Okay, so as per this law, if you invent something which is new and useful, then after you register your invention or the idea, you'll be given the full power on that idea for generally 20 long years, which means no one else can use this idea or your invention without your consent to earn profits for the year for the duration, that is 20 years. So in terms of Neem patent, the European Patent Office, or the EPO, in 1994, they granted patent on the use of the antifungal agents extracted from the neem tree to the United States Department of Agriculture and the multinational agribusiness corporation. But then this patenting of neem plant was opposed strongly by the leftists, since the use of neem plant for medicinal purposes has been in India for over 2,000 years. So under this patent law, India would not be able to use the neem plant for fungal purposes. But then, since this medicinal practice of neem has been there in India since long time back, since over 2,000 years, they had to fight a case against this patenting, and of course India won. So actually, you don't have to remember the meaning of patenting. I just told you this as a background knowledge so that you could understand why the Indian people protest against the patenting of neem plants as such. From the examination point of view, for you, you just need to remember that the leftists were against the patenting of certain plants. Okay, that's it. All right. Now, the next one we have is the Rightist perspective. Now, the rightists or the nationalists, or those who hold conservative views, now they object the various cultural influences. Okay, here we are talking about the cultural influence. Their protest is against the cultural influence on the people which happens from the availability of foreign TV channels, which are of course provided by the cable network. Okay, so they are against the impact it has put on our youth, or which has influenced our people to the extent of celebrating Valentine's Day and wearing Western dresses by girl students in schools and colleges, because they fear that this cultural influence will eventually erode our own rich cultural heritage, or you can say it will eventually lead to the extinction of our own rich cultural heritage. Okay, so this is it. A quick recap. Globalization has been a controversial issue, and we know that there has been debates on the impact of globalization, and in this clip we learned about the resistance to globalization. We learned how the leftists who believes in equality feel that the globalization benefits only fewer people, and it actually widens the gap between the rich and the poor. Here, when you're talking about rich people, you are talking about the multinational companies and the developed countries. Okay, we also saw how they feel the state's capacity is reduced due to globalization, how the state's function has reduced to only fulfilling the core duties, that is looking after the law and order and the security of the people and the country. The rightists who holds conservative views, now they are concerned and they expressed their concerns over the political, economic and cultural effects. We then talked about the various anti-globalization movements that took at the World Trade Organization's ministerial meeting at Seattle, and the World Social Forum, which is composed of various social groups. Finally, we talked about the different phases of India's globalization, how the British government exploited Indian economy during the colonial rule by making India export raw materials to England at a cheaper rate and import finished goods from England at a higher rate. We also learned how the Indian government adopted protectionism under closed economy after it gains its independence to protect its domestic producers, but then suffered economic crisis, because of which they had to undergo economic reform in 1991 and adopted economic liberalism. But then the economic liberalism was also criticized by the leftists, who believes that this leads to a huge gap between the rich and the poor. And we also learned about their protest against the entry of the multinational companies and the patenting policy. And last but not the least, we learned how the rightists object the Western cultural influence over the Indian culture and their fear, towards the erosion of our cultural heritage. And with this, we have come to the end of our last chapter of the first book. This chapter is very easy and is very relevant to us since we are a part of this globalization. I hope you all have understood this chapter well. I'm leaving the notes on this chapter in the description below so that you can easily have an access to it. Okay? Next, we'll be covering our second book. So until I meet you in my next video, revise the chapters that we have already learned and stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.